Well, so far, no volunteers, no Discord, and as for feedback, it's kind of a gray area whether I got what you'd call enough for the holy spec for Paladins, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. I knew going into Project Decade that now and then I'll end up making mistakes and thus doing things that are downright cringe. Hopefully hilariously cringe rather than the regular kind of cringe. But here's the thing. When I know something is cringe, e.g. the Affliction Warlock video, I can actually make some jokes about it. But when I have no idea and don't see it coming, there's no jokes, so it's not hilariously cringe, it's just sad. And I didn't see it coming that my own spec would be in the latter category. So it's not altogether surprising that I got my head chewed off with my first attempt at getting feedback. Did get some, but the funny thing is, all the feedback focused on A, the 3 unprunings, and B, the fact that I still play the old-fashioned way with hard casting. Even though these videos are supposed to be about my player power upgrade system concept and what it can do for the players, none of the feedback actually mentioned the upgrades themselves, or at least not the specific ones I created for Iteration 1 for Holy Paladins. But given the feedback about how important, that is to say currently optimal and what today's players are used to, the never hardcast builds and rotations are these days, and how Light of the Martyr really is used in Mythic Plus, I was able to figure out what goals I should have for putting together upgrades and have adjusted Iteration 2 according to those new goals. The new design goals are as follows. Number 1, have upgrades that make sense for an instant build that help with single target healing. Number 2, have upgrades that make sense for an instant build that help with multi-target healing. And then goals 3 and 4 are the same for builds that hardcast. I get that hardcasting isn't the optimal way to play at the moment, but players should be able to play the way they like. That's a lesson I hope to the light that Blizzard takes to heart in every aspect of World of Warcraft, from class design to endgame content to flavor to systems design. I made the mistake of building Iteration 1 as if hardcasting was the right way to play, and a lot of the feedback I got made the assumption that instant is the right way to play. The lesson I gathered walking away from that was that there is no single right way to play World of Warcraft. Players should be able to find their own fun in their own play styles and in the content that they like. And that's something I got to keep in mind when I'm setting up my design goals. Anyhow, with those goals in mind, let's start on what I did to the unpruned abilities, which is actually going to take most of this video's time. But anyways, first of all, Denounce. Once upon a time, there was a glyph that made Denounce instant cast, which in turn was inspired by another Once Upon a Time. Back in Cataclysm, in the first patch, the Denounce passive talent caused Exorcism to become instant cast after you cast Holy Shock. So inspired by those two Once Upon a Times, I added the passive that Denounce could become instant after you cast Holy Shock or Divine Shock, so that'll make it usable for instant builds. Secondly, Holy Radiance doesn't look a thing like it did when I started. I'd originally wanted something that A, had no cooldown at all, B, was channeled, C, provided group healing to nearby allies so as to incentivize and leverage our mastery, D, improved mobility, and E, granted holy power. My intent behind that original version of Holy Radiance was to take all the best aspects of Holy Radiance from its entire 3 expansion history. Of course, when I say best, I mean best from the perspective of a hardcaster, which right there is a problem when instant is the style du jour, and I will get into that later in this video. But back to why I set up Iteration 1's Holy Radiance the way I did. The very first version of Holy Radiance from the start of Cataclysm was way different from what it was in Mists or Warlords. It was instant cast for starters, a multi-target heal over time that radiated healing to allies near the caster. It was compared to turning yourself into a healing stream totem, and at first it was a 30-second cooldown. Blizzard added it back when they were deep into the bring the player not the class design philosophy, which honestly was one of their better class design philosophies over the years, and I really miss it and very much believe it would go a long way to winning back the crowd if they embraced bring the player not the class once more. Anyhow, there was also a talent during Cataclysm that increased your run speed right after you cast Holy Radiance, or after you cast Divine Protection for some odd reason. It's really tempting to go off on a tangent and talk about how I used that talent this one time during Cataclysm, but I'll save that for another video. My first version of Holy Radiance was based off of this earliest Cataclysm version, in large part because our current mastery, being near allies, is encouraged. And if we had a group heal that out and out required us to be near allies for the ability to actually do anything, well, that would mesh all the better with our mastery. Of course, that Cataclysm version of Holy Radiance didn't provide holy power. It had a cooldown, it was instant rather than channeled. So why did I add holy power generation and a channel to it? And why did I make it so that it had no cooldown, for that matter? Well, first of all, it wasn't until feedback came to me that I found out how important it was to have stuff be instant cast. I just didn't have the context to hold me back from changing that instant cast thing, so that's one thing. And the primary source of cringeness for my first iteration to boot. Besides that, I really liked the version of Holy Radiance that we had in Mists and Warlords. It was timed cast, and it provided holy power when we cast it. This gave me this flow where I could cast Holy Radiance twice and then get one holy power each time I did, and then cast Holy Shock, then cast Light of Dawn, rinse and repeat. It was a pretty nice flow for multi-target healing, and I could switch away from that flow back into the single-target flow whenever I needed to. It was seamless and elegant, and I just loved it. So I wanted something that would give me an experience like that, which is why I added the channel and the holy power generation. Holy Radiance would consume 2 global cooldowns while you were channeling it. You could move faster while you were channeling it to get to whichever group needed the healing, and you got 2 holy power from it, and since it had no cooldown, it provided a flow that led into Light of Dawn pretty easily. And I picked channeling for a few reasons. First of all, it felt like there were more channeled abilities that let you channel while moving than there were timed cast abilities that let you cast while moving. Number 2, I wanted the speed boost in there, so I wanted something that you could move while channeling or casting or what have you. And number 3, back during Warlords, there was a legitimate issue with Holy Paladin's kits where every ability felt the same. Holy Radiance, Holy Light, Word of Glory, and Flash of Light were all timed cast, and pretty much only differed in terms of what resources they spent or generated and under what conditions they did the generating. I figured I'd be able to keep away from that issue if I went with a channeled spell instead of a timed cast spell. That's also part of the reason why I had Word of Light as a channeled spell as a small aside. So all that was an in-depth explanation of the thinking behind the first version of Holy Radiance, even more depth than I had in the first video. Ugh. Honestly, I have this screen name Longwriter for a reason. I tend to include a lot of detail when I write or create something, and that means whatever I make or write tends to be, well, long. And if something's too long, it detracts from its quality and or makes people think it's not worth looking at because it'll take too much time to look at it. The solution for that is to learn the art of leaving things out of what I'd like to talk about. That's a balancing act, too. Leave out too much and there's not enough context. Don't leave enough out and it'll be too long. In retrospect, I should have given more context to why I made Holy Radiance the way I did in the first iteration, but I didn't. Oops. So now I should give lots and lots of context to why I've basically taken the Light Orb upgrade from Iteration 1, renamed it Holy Radiance, and then taken the Warlords of Draenor version of Holy Radiance, put it into Iteration 2 as an upgrade, and giving it a name that has never been the name of any ability that we have ever had. Well, first of all, Light Orb was instant. That just automatically means it's more appealing as a basic ability for instant builds, which is why I swapped their places, partly. Another part of it is that this version of Holy Radiance harkens back to Uther's version of Holy Radiance, which is that orb of light that travels forward, damaging enemies and healing allies. And after some reflection, I thought to myself, I guess this is what Holy Radiance is now. What it became in Heroes of the Storm, which actually isn't too bad. In this form, Holy Radiance is a kind of an oh-snap button, a fairly short cooldown that lets you put out a sizable group heal, and since it provides holy power, it lets you immediately follow up with a Light of Dawn for even more group healing, no matter where your holy power was before you cast this version of Holy Radiance. It's not a flow per se like the flow Holy Radiance provided in Warlords and Mists, but it gives you a group heal when you need it, plus it just plain looks and feels cool. Of course, I liked having a flow that permits continuous group healing. That is why Divine Circle is a thing in the upgrades. It trades the burst group healing of the new Holy Radiance for sustained group healing. It also trades off instant for timed cast, of course, since I think that timed cast is still a legitimate playstyle. Honestly, dealing with the feedback I got for Iteration 1 of Holy taught me I should never assume that my way of playing WoW is the only way. Really, no one should ever make that assumption. I should add that both the new instant cast Uther-esque Holy Radiance and the Divine Circle upgrade for it have the ability to damage enemies because, well, if Blizzard actually did this, if they actually unpruned 3 abilities for Holy Paladins like I hope they do, then they'd probably feel a need to remove something else to make room. I really wish they wouldn't feel that kind of need and just add those abilities. Just add them without removing other abilities. Having lots of abilities is fun. Getting lots of abilities is fun. Those are the reasons why I set up the upgrade system to be ever expandable and to allow players to swap which upgrades they have equipped anytime they're out of combat. De facto, that means they have more abilities in their kits, albeit with a limit on how many of those abilities are actually on their spell bars at any one time. But I digress. If Blizzard wanted to remove an ability to make room, the ability they'd remove would probably be Consecration. If we had another multi-target damage ability in our baseline kits to take Consecration's place, then losing Consecration wouldn't be so bad. I played through Mists and Warlords without a decent baseline multi-target damage ability on a short cooldown, and that bad play experience taught me that no spec, not even a healer, should be without a multi-target damage ability that is either on a short cooldown or no cooldown at all. If any spec lacks a multi-target damage ability, then that's a sign of a class design failure. Anyhow, before I move on to the new upgrades, I should talk about Rebuke a little. It seems like a lot of the bosses in Torghast are built with the idea in mind that the player should be able to interrupt their casts. In fact, there are some bosses where I just plain can't win against them as a Holy Paladin, and at the time I was fighting them, it at least seemed like the reason why I couldn't win is because I had no interrupt. Warden of Souls and Watchers of Death come to mind. Maybe I make a wrong assumption that an interrupt would let me win, but even so, I figure re-adding an interrupt like I had in Mists and Warlords would help even things up and make things possible in Torghast that weren't possible before. Yes, I keep talking about Mists and Warlords because in those expansions, class design felt like it provided a much better play experience then than we have now. Anyhow, it was also just plain more fun while soloing to have the ability to interrupt than it was not to have that ability. Also, other posters pointed out that to make it fair and fun, other healers should get their interrupts back too. Spear Hand Strike will definitely be unpruned for Mistweaver monks, but Holy and Disciplined priests never had an interrupt. Restoration Shaman already have Wind Shear, and the Druid interrupt is a cat or bear form ability called Skull Bash. So it doesn't quite make sense to me to add interrupts in those cases. I'm open to the idea that I'm wrong about that. And I'd talk about that more, but I've already yammered on about the baseline changes for over half of this video's duration, and I haven't even started on the upgrades. I can talk more about interrupts for those other specs when, or perhaps if, I get to their videos. So let's talk about the Iteration 2 upgrades that I have for Holy Paladins. Number 1, Noontide, an upgrade for Light of Dawn. The healing is no longer a frontal cone. It picks the most injured targets near you and heals for a bit more than Light of Dawn, but it only heals 4 targets maximum. Number 2, Divine Shock has been changed. More abilities can trigger the effect where Divine Shock doesn't incur its own cooldown. Instants like Judgment and Crusader Strike have been added, as has Denounce, and so have the Holy Power Spenders. Number 3, Clarity of Purpose is a new upgrade for Infusion of Light, of all things. It adds to the effects that Infusion of Light usually has. It also affects Light of the Martyr, making it castable on self and drastically lowering its health cost. It can also buff Divine Circle to be instant cast, and it's got a small chance not to get consumed when you use it. Number 4, Divine Circle, which I've already talked about. The only thing I have to add is that I totally took the name of the upgrade from the icon itself. Number 5, Fist of the Heavens, which is unchanged. An upgrade for Judgment that drops Holy Lightning on the target, dealing Light Storm damage instead of straight-up Holy damage, slightly healing allies near your target. Number 6 is Word of Light, that is unchanged, a channeled upgrade for Word of Glory that heals for more and uses some Holy channeled graphics that players haven't yet gotten their hands on, and it can be used to damage enemies. Number 7 is Natural Light, which is also unchanged. It's technically considered a Nature School spell, and it benefits more from your mastery than Flash of Light would. Now for the thinking behind these new upgrades. I wanted to create a spread that has things that help for all 4 of the gameplay purposes, both hard casting and instant group healing, and both hard casting and instant single target healing. If you use an instant build and you want to optimize for single target healing, then there's Divine Shock, Clarity of Purpose, and Fist of the Heavens. That last one will probably help a little. Actually, there's not that much, and it'll probably be all about Divine Shock and to a lesser extent Clarity, with Fist of the Heavens providing a small amount of gravy and garnish. Actually, I'm toying with the idea of taking out Word of Light and bringing back an older talent, Eternal Glory, which gives Word of Glory a heal over time component. Again, I'd want it castable on enemies if I did that. The reason I'm tempted to do that is Eternal Glory would be instant, and therefore this would be appealing for instant builds for single target. If you're into instants and want to optimize for multi-target, there's Fist of the Heavens, Noontide, and either Divine Circle with Clarity of Purpose or Divine Shock, simply because Divine Shock means more holy power. Which is 5 upgrades, including 2 that interact with each other directly, which makes me wonder if I'd done goofed again and need further tweaks to optimize this. Anyhow, if you're into hard casting and want to optimize for single target healing, there's Word of Light, Divine Shock, Natural Light, and Clarity of Purpose, which is 4, which makes me wonder if I made these things too versatile, considering that only 3 are equipable at any one time. If you're into hard casting and want to optimize for multi-target, there's Noontide, Fist of the Heavens, and either Divine Circle or Divine Shock, depending on whether you're into burst or sustains. So this helps. It really does. Also, Clarity of Purpose is this talent from Cataclysm that didn't last long, but it had a cool enough icon and name, so I used that. I decided I ought to have something that enhances Light of the Martyr in one way or another, so I added that to Clarity of Purpose. I also figure that going off the beaten path and upgrading a passive instead of upgrading an active ability, at least once in a while, can be a good way to shake things up design-wise. I mean, passives can contribute almost as much to a kit as active abilities. I also wanted to add a small random buff to make Clarity of Purpose sometimes not get consumed, because I wanted it appealing for hardcasting builds as well. Though I do wonder about the Divine Circle buff I added to it. Simply by adding that, I made Divine Circle usable by instant builds, and basically forced instant builds to either take both Divine Circle and Clarity of Purpose or neither, which leaves me wondering if I should have forgotten about making Divine Circle usable for instant builds and just left well enough alone. I mean, the more flexibility these customization systems provide, the more likely it is that players will be able to find their fun using them. And intentionally tying 2 upgrades together makes the whole system less flexible, so I really worry about whether I did the right thing here. Maybe I should have baked the instant with Infusion of Light buff into Divine Circle itself instead of tying that to Clarity of Purpose. Anyhow, I realized that the way I'd set up Divine Shock in the first iteration, it was little to no help for builds that focus on instant cast abilities. So I added more abilities that actually trigger the no cooldown incurred effect, and now it's like anything you do other than casting Divine Shock itself can give you an extra Divine Shock. Now, I had thought about setting it up so that Divine Shock simply has a chance not to incur its own cooldown, but then I realized what the benefit was of Cataclysm's implementation of the Daybreak talent. You got to see extra holy shocks coming and react to them as you saw fit. You'd get a little less time to react if I implemented Divine Shock as having a chance not to reset its own cooldown. Plus, this provides extra incentives to push other buttons. And who knows? Different buttons could have different chances to trigger the effect, thus completely changing the weights on how much you want to press those buttons. I went as far as including Crusader Strike, which already has a talent that lets you use Holy Shock more often, because the way Daybreak worked in Cataclysm, you would get extra Holy Shocks by using abilities that you'd normally use, which Crusader Strike counts as in this case, and all of that was the thinking behind adding Crusader Strike. I do wonder if I went too far by including the Holy Power Spenders in the list. Anyhow, from what I gathered from feedback, Light of Dawn is pretty important for instant builds, so I figured I should upgrade it. I remember that the Mists and Warlords version of Light of Dawn didn't actually require you to be facing a particular direction for it to work, so I decided to bring a bit of that flavor back. I picked the name Noontide because that implies the sun is straight overhead and shining straight down in a beam around you. Now, for a while, I was going to boot out Natural Light and Objection to make room for the two new upgrades of Noontide and Clarity of Purpose. That left my personal favorite upgrade intact, which was the Holy Wrath upgrade, which was really a Holy Bolt Volley spell. I just really have a thing about Bolt Volley spells. But then I realized something. Divine Circle was a multi-target range damage ability with no cooldown, and Holy Wrath was also a multi-target range damage ability with no cooldown. There was no reason to have both in the same spread of upgrades, and since Divine Circle was superior in every way except for the number of targets affected and mana cost, I kicked out Holy Wrath and brought Natural Light back in. I have my doubts about that, since that leaves 4 potential upgrades for a hard-casting single-target spec, while only 3 slots can be used at a time, but, well, if the upgrade system gets expanded on, we're going to run into that kind of problem eventually, so maybe I shouldn't worry about it now. Objection was always going to be cannon fodder. I kept upgrading interrupt abilities because they were easy to upgrade. But after the fact, I realized that there are much better things I could upgrade that do a better job providing playstyle customization and optimization. Besides, as cool as an idea as Objection was, Retribution can do better with it than Holy can. Speaking of Retribution, at least they have Sanctification that can count as a Holy Bolt Volley spell, I guess. I just really like the aesthetic and concept of Bolt Volley spells. I added them all over the place, and I'm really sad Holy Wrath didn't make it in. But I'll tell you one thing. If I were going to bring it into the spread, I'd implement it as a powerful ability on a cooldown, probably just to differentiate it from Divine Circle. The reason behind that is, well, plenty of other Bolt Volley spells have cooldowns. Frostbolt Volley, Fireball Volley, at least the Iteration 1 version. I might have it upgrade Flame Strike in Iteration 2, and actually that's it. Lightning Bolt Volley, Freya's Wrath, Arcane Barrage, which I didn't even add, and Shadow Bolt Volley all have no cooldown. They're more or less spenders, but oh well. Since those other Bolt Volley spells wouldn't get spammed, it'd still make sense to have Holy Wrath have a cooldown. I'm not sure what it would upgrade, though. Making it upgrade Denounce makes less sense as far as its effect goes, honestly. Judgment is iffy. Consecration might work, but Sanctification is, dare I say it, cooler. Maybe it would upgrade Denounce anyway, trading an ability with no cooldown that acts as a filler for a multi-target cooldown? Maybe, but I'd be lying if I pretended I wasn't arriving at Denounce by process of elimination. You know, I just realized something. In my first iteration, there were about 2 utility abilities, Objection and Holy Wrath. Generally, I did that, and had at least 2 or 3 utility abilities per spread. Sometimes when I was really running low on ideas, I had 4. But in this iteration too, none of these are utility. Every one of them in one way or another buffs healing. A few buff damage, but they all buff healing. I think I did that because I was trying to fulfill 4 different design goals, but now I'm in a scenario where some of these goals have more than 3 options. I'm a little inclined to remove Fist of the Heavens, as cool as it looks and feels, and slide in Speed of Light or Objection in its place. I may do that in iteration 3 depending on feedback. So, did I do better in iteration 2 than I did in iteration 1? You be the judge. I'll stop making iterations when players like what they see, but I'll probably move on to other specs and make iteration 2s for all of them before I start on any specs iteration 3. So far, my iteration 3 ideas are, number 1, modify Divine Circle so that it can become instant by consuming either Infusion of Light or Clarity of Purpose, thus decoupling the Clarity of Purpose upgrade from the Divine Circle upgrade. Number 2, switch out Word of Light for Eternal Glory because Eternal Glory is instant. And number 3, switch out Fist of the Heavens for either Speed of Light or Objection. Please let me know what you think of those ideas, though it could be a long time before I get to them at the rate I'm going.